The screaming stopped at exactly midnight on October 13th, 1888. That's what the lone survivor would later tell authorities, though her testimony was so disturbing that the Philadelphia Police Department sealed the case files for nearly a century. What Margaret Whitmore witnessed in the basement of the Salvation Through Suffering Church that autumn night would challenge everything the civilized world believed about the limits of religious devotion and human cruelty. Hidden beneath the floorboards of what appeared to be an ordinary Methodist chapel, Reverend Cyrus Bell had constructed something that defied both divine law and human decency, a baptismal chamber where salvation came not through water, but through blood, where redemption required not confession but sacrifice, and where the faithful lined up eagerly to receive what Bell called the ultimate purification. For 3 years, the residents of Philadelphia's Kensington district had whispered about the strange congregation that met behind shuttered windows on Allegheny Avenue. They spoke of miraculous healings, of profound spiritual transformations, and of followers who emerged from Bell's services with a light in their eyes that seemed to burn from somewhere beyond the mortal world. What they didn't know was that this light came at a price measured not in coins, but in pints of human blood. The autumn of 1888 had brought with it an unusually harsh winter that seemed to settle over Philadelphia like a burial shroud. The city's poorest neighborhoods, already struggling with overcrowding and disease, became breeding grounds for desperation and despair. It was into this darkness that Reverend Cyrus Bell stepped, offering hope to those who had been abandoned by both society and God. Bell had arrived in Kensington in the spring of 1885, a tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes and hands that seemed too large for his skeletal frame. He claimed to have received his calling during a fever dream in the Alabama swamps, where he had been ministering to former slaves who had been cast out by their white congregations. According to his own testimony, delivered to his earliest followers with mesmerizing intensity, Christ himself had appeared to him during his illness and revealed the true nature of salvation. The vision, as Bell described it, had shown him that traditional baptism was merely symbolic, a pale imitation of the real purification that God demanded of his chosen people. Water could cleanse the body, but only blood could cleanse the soul. Not the metaphorical blood of Christ's sacrifice, but actual, flowing human blood that would wash away sin and create a direct connection between the believer and the divine. This revelation, Bell claimed, came with specific instructions. The blood could not be taken by force, for coerced sacrifice held no spiritual power. It had to be given willingly, joyfully, by believers who understood they were participating in the most sacred act possible. And it had to be fresh, drawn directly from living vessels into consecrated chalices that Bell had blessed according to rituals he claimed to have received in subsequent visions. The early days of Bell's ministry in Philadelphia were marked by carefully orchestrated displays of what appeared to be genuine spiritual power. He arrived in Kensington with letters of recommendation from Methodist bishops in Alabama, documents that seemed authentic enough to secure him the use of an abandoned church building on Allegheny Avenue. The structure, a former Methodist chapel that had been shuttered after its congregation died off during a cholera outbreak, provided the perfect setting for Bell's unique brand of salvation. Bell's first converts were drawn from the most desperate segments of Kensington's population. Widows struggling to feed their children, men disabled by industrial accidents and abandoned by their employers, immigrants who had fled poverty in Ireland and Germany only to find even worse conditions in America's cities. These were people for whom traditional religion had offered little comfort and even less practical assistance. Bell, by contrast, promised immediate and tangible results. His early services followed conventional Methodist patterns, with hymns, scripture readings, and sermons that focused on themes of suffering and redemption. But Bell gradually introduced elements that set his ministry apart from anything his followers had experienced before. He spoke of special blessings, available only to those who demonstrated absolute faith, of secret knowledge that could transform ordinary believers into vessels of divine power. The transformation began with what Bell called purification rituals. Followers who showed particular devotion were invited to participate in private ceremonies conducted in the church basement, a stone chamber that Bell had modified according to specifications he claimed to have received in his visions. These selected believers would emerge from the basement sessions with bandages on their arms and expressions of profound spiritual ecstasy that convinced other congregation members that something truly miraculous was occurring below. Word of Bell's healing powers spread through Kensington's immigrant communities with the speed that only desperation can generate. Parents brought children suffering from tuberculosis, consumption, and other diseases that conventional medicine couldn't treat. Men came seeking relief from the chronic pain of industrial injuries. Women arrived hoping for cures to the mental disturbances that seemed to plague so many in the overcrowded tenements. Bell's treatment methods were unlike anything practiced by legitimate medical professionals. He would lay hands on the afflicted while reciting prayers in what he claimed was the original Aramaic language of Christ. He would anoint patients with oils that he said had been blessed by direct contact with sacred relics. And for those whose conditions were most severe, he offered what he called the ultimate healing, a procedure that required participation in the blood purification ritual. The basement chamber where these purifications took place had been transformed into something that resembled a twisted parody of a traditional baptismal font. The stone floor had been carved with intricate symbols that Bell claimed represented the 72 names of God revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. Candles made from what appeared to be human fat cast flickering shadows on walls covered with biblical verses written in languages that no one in the congregation could identify. At the center of the chamber stood Bell's masterpiece, a marble basin that he had somehow acquired and modified for his purposes. The basin, originally designed for conventional water baptisms, had been fitted with a complex system of tubes and channels that allowed for the collection, filtering, and redistribution of blood drawn from participants in the purification ritual. The ritual itself, as later reconstructed from Margaret Whitmore's testimony and physical evidence found in the chamber, followed a precise sequence that Bell had refined over 3 years of practice. Participants would enter the basement chamber wearing white robes that Bell provided, symbolizing their willingness to be purified. They would then lie on stone altars arranged around the central basin, while Bell used consecrated knives to open veins in their arms and legs. The blood would flow through the channel system into the central basin, where Bell would bless it with prayers and incantations that seemed to draw from multiple religious traditions. Once the basin was filled, participants would be submerged in the warm blood, while Bell proclaimed their sins forgiven and their souls purified. The entire process could take several hours, during which participants often fell into trance-like states that Bell interpreted as direct communion with the divine. What made the ritual particularly insidious was Bell's ability to control the amount of blood extracted from each participant. Newcomers to the purification process would lose only small amounts, enough to create a sense of sacrifice without causing serious harm. But as followers became more deeply indoctrinated into Bell's theology, they were encouraged to give increasingly larger amounts of blood, proving their devotion through their willingness to suffer for their faith. Bell had developed sophisticated techniques for maximizing blood extraction while keeping participants alive and conscious throughout the ritual. He used tourniquets and pressure points to control bleeding, herbal preparations that he claimed promoted rapid blood production, and carefully calculated intervals between purification sessions that allowed followers to recover between donations. The psychological conditioning that made this systematic blood harvesting possible was as carefully orchestrated as the physical procedures. Bell preached that suffering was not merely acceptable to God, but actually required for true salvation. He taught that Christ's crucifixion had established blood sacrifice as the only path to divine forgiveness, and that traditional churches had corrupted this truth by substituting symbolic rituals for the real thing. Followers were taught to view their participation in blood purification as a privilege reserved for only the most spiritually advanced believers. Those who could endure the greatest blood loss were celebrated as saints and given positions of authority within the congregation. Those who showed reluctance or fear were subjected to additional indoctrination sessions designed to overcome their spiritual weakness. The community that developed around Bell's blood purification practices displayed characteristics that would later be recognized as classic signs of cult manipulation. Members were encouraged to sever ties with family and friends who didn't understand their spiritual journey. They were required to turn over their worldly possessions to support the church's mission. Most importantly, they were taught that questioning Bell's methods or teachings was evidence of insufficient faith that required correction through additional purification rituals. By the summer of 1888, Bell's congregation had grown to over 200 regular members, with an inner circle of approximately 50 individuals who participated in the blood purification rituals on a monthly basis. These core followers showed the physical signs of chronic blood loss, pale complexion, weakness, and a peculiar emotional detachment that witnesses described as otherworldly serenity. The church's financial resources had grown correspondingly. Members contributed not only their personal savings, but also property deeds, family heirlooms, and other valuables that Bell claimed were necessary for the church's expansion. These resources allowed Bell to acquire additional properties in Kensington, creating what amounted to a religious compound where his most devoted followers could live in complete isolation from the outside world. It was in these satellite properties that Bell conducted his most extreme purification rituals, ceremonies that went far beyond the blood extraction procedures practiced in the main church basement. Margaret Whitmore, who had joined the congregation in early 1888 after her husband died in a factory accident, was gradually introduced to these advanced practices through a careful progression of increasingly intensive purification sessions. Whitmore's testimony, recorded by Philadelphia police detectives 3 days after her escape from Bell's compound, provides the most detailed account of the final evolution of his blood purification theology. According to her statement, Bell had begun teaching his inner circle that individual purification was merely the first step in a larger divine plan that required what he called collective sacrifice. This collective sacrifice involved the simultaneous purification of multiple participants with their combined blood, creating a spiritual resonance that Bell claimed could open direct channels of communication with God. The ritual required participants to give substantially more blood than previous ceremonies, amounts that Bell assured them would be replaced through divine intervention once the purification was complete. The preparations for what Bell called the Great Purification began in early October 1888 with intensive indoctrination sessions designed to prepare his most devoted followers for the ultimate sacrifice. Bell preached that God had revealed to him that the time had come for his congregation to transcend their earthly existence and join Christ in paradise. This transcendence, he explained, required a final purification that would consume their entire physical being, transforming their blood into a gateway between the mortal and divine realms. The ritual itself was scheduled for October 13th, chosen because Bell claimed it was the anniversary of Christ's true crucifixion, which he argued had been deliberately misdated by corrupt church authorities. 43 of Bell's most devoted followers agreed to participate in the Great Purification, viewing it as the culmination of their spiritual journey and their ticket to immediate salvation. Margaret Whitmore was among those selected for the ritual, but her participation was complicated by doubts that had been growing throughout the summer of 1888. She had begun to notice that some of her fellow congregants who had participated in the most intensive purification sessions had not returned to regular services. When she asked Bell about their absence, he explained that they had achieved such complete purification that they no longer needed earthly fellowship, having been called to serve God in higher realms. These explanations had satisfied Whitmore initially, but she began to suspect something more sinister when she discovered personal belongings of missing congregants being sold at local pawn shops. Her attempts to investigate these disappearances led to increasingly hostile reactions from Bell and his inner circle, who accused her of lacking the faith necessary for true purification. The events of October 13th began at sunset, with participants gathering in the main church for a final preparatory service. Bell preached with unusual intensity about the glory that awaited those brave enough to surrender their earthly existence for divine transformation. He spoke of visions he had received, showing Christ preparing a special place in paradise for those who proved their faith through ultimate sacrifice. As darkness fell, the participants processed to the basement chamber, which had been prepared for the great purification, with additional altar stones and an expanded system of channels leading to multiple collection basins. Bell had acquired what appeared to be ancient ceremonial knives, implements that he claimed had been used in the original blood sacrifice rituals practiced by Christ's apostles. The ritual began with individual purifications, each participant taking their turn on the altar stones while Bell opened their veins with the ceremonial knives. But unlike previous ceremonies, the blood loss continued well beyond the usual limits. Bell assured the increasingly weak participants that their faintness was evidence of their spirits beginning to separate from their earthly bodies, the first stage of their divine transformation. Margaret Whitmore was among the last to be purified, and by the time her turn arrived, she could see that several of her fellow participants were no longer responding to Bell's commands. Some lay motionless on their altar stones, their faces grey and their breathing shallow. Others mumbled incoherently, apparently lost in what Bell described as prophetic visions, but which Whitmore recognized as delirium caused by severe blood loss. It was at this moment that Whitmore's survival instincts finally overcame her religious conditioning. As Bell approached with his ceremonial knife, she suddenly understood that the great purification was not a path to paradise, but a carefully orchestrated mass suicide designed to eliminate witnesses to 3 years of systematic blood harvesting and financial fraud. Whitmore's escape from the basement chamber was facilitated by the confusion that erupted when several participants began convulsing and dying from blood loss. In the chaos, she was able to reach the stairs leading to the main church and then to the street, where she collapsed and was found by a passing police patrol. The police investigation that followed Whitmore's rescue revealed the full scope of Bell's operation. The basement chamber contained the bodies of 31 congregation members who had died during the Great Purification ritual, along with evidence of at least 20 additional deaths that had occurred during previous purification ceremonies. Hidden rooms beneath the church basement contained the preserved remains of congregation members who had disappeared over the previous 3 years, their bodies drained of blood and their personal belongings catalogued for later sale. Bell himself was never found. When police arrived at the church compound on the morning of October 14th, they discovered that he had vanished sometime during the night, leaving behind only a note claiming that God had called him to establish a new congregation in the Western Territories. Despite extensive searches and nationwide alerts, no trace of Bell was ever discovered. The surviving members of Bell's congregation, those who had not participated in the Great Purification ritual, were found to be in various stages of physical and psychological deterioration from repeated blood extractions. Many required extended medical treatment and psychiatric care to overcome the effects of their indoctrination. Several never fully recovered, spending their remaining years in state asylums, where they continued to speak of the divine visions they had experienced during their purification sessions. The financial investigation revealed that Bell had systematically defrauded his congregation of over $50,000 in cash and property, equivalent to more than $1 million in today's currency. The money and valuables had been converted to portable assets that disappeared along with Bell, suggesting that his religious mission had been at least partially motivated by conventional greed. The Philadelphia authorities faced a significant challenge in deciding how to handle the case. The discovery of systematic blood harvesting and mass murder conducted under the guise of religious practice threatened to create panic about the safety of legitimate religious institutions. There were also concerns about anti-immigrant sentiment, as many of Bell's victims had been recent arrivals from Ireland and Germany who might be blamed for their gullibility. The solution was to classify the case as a criminal fraud investigation rather than a religious persecution case. Bell was charged with multiple counts of murder, theft, and practicing medicine without a license, but the specific details of his blood purification rituals were excluded from public records. The surviving congregation members were quietly relocated to other cities, and the church building was demolished to prevent it from becoming a site of morbid curiosity. Margaret Whitmore's testimony was sealed as part of the case files, and she was provided with a new identity and financial support to relocate to California. She lived under an assumed name for the rest of her life, never speaking publicly about her experiences with Bell's congregation. Her detailed account of the blood purification rituals and the Great Purification Ceremony was not made available to researchers until the case files were partially declassified in the 1980s. The psychological analysis of Bell's methods, conducted decades later by criminologists studying religious fraud, revealed sophisticated techniques of manipulation that would later be recognized in other cult cases. Bell had combined legitimate religious imagery with carefully calibrated physical and emotional trauma to create a state of psychological dependency that made his followers willing participants in their own exploitation. The blood purification rituals served multiple purposes in Bell's system. They provided a source of income through the sale of extracted blood to medical institutions that asked few questions about its origins. They created a sense of shared sacrifice that bonded participants to the group and to Bell personally, and they gradually weakened participants both physically and mentally, making them more susceptible to increasingly extreme demands. The theological framework that Bell used to justify these practices drew from multiple religious traditions in ways that would have been impossible for his largely uneducated followers to challenge. He combined Christian imagery of blood sacrifice with elements borrowed from ancient mystery religions, creating a synthetic belief system that seemed both familiar and revolutionary to people whose religious education had been limited to conventional Protestant services. The case of Reverend Cyrus Bell remains one of the most disturbing examples of religious exploitation in American history, notable not only for the systematic nature of his crimes, but also for the willingness of his victims to participate in their own destruction. The Philadelphia Police Department's investigation concluded that Bell had perfected techniques of psychological manipulation that could convince ordinary people to engage in behaviors that violated their most basic instincts for self-preservation. The long-term impact of Bell's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The case contributed to increased skepticism about itinerant preachers and unconventional religious practices, leading to new regulations requiring religious institutions to register with local authorities and submit to periodic inspections. It also influenced the development of medical ethics guidelines that prohibited the acquisition of blood or other biological materials without proper documentation of their origins. Perhaps most significantly, the Bell case provided early insights into the psychology of cult manipulation that would prove valuable in understanding similar cases that emerged throughout the 20th century. Researchers studying the sealed case files identified patterns of indoctrination, isolation, and graduated exploitation that appeared in later investigations of destructive religious movements. The physical location of Bell's church compound remained a source of local unease for decades after the building's demolition. Residents of the Kensington neighborhood reported strange occurrences at the site, including unexplained red stains that appeared on the ground during heavy rains and a persistent metallic odor that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. These phenomena were never scientifically investigated, but they contributed to the site's reputation as cursed ground that should not be disturbed. In 1924, a developer attempted to construct apartment buildings on the former church site, but was forced to abandon the project when construction workers refused to continue digging after discovering what appeared to be human bones and fragments of ceremonial implements buried deep beneath the surface. The site remained vacant until the 1960s, when it was finally converted to a small public park that local residents continued to avoid after dark. The fate of the estimated $50,000 that Bell stole from his congregation was never determined. Some investigators theorized that he had established new identities in Western territories where law enforcement was minimal and regulatory oversight virtually non-existent. Others suggested that he might have fled to Mexico or South America, regions where his knowledge of religious manipulation could have been applied to new victims who would never be connected to his Philadelphia crimes. A few tantalizing clues emerged over the years that suggested Bell might have continued his blood purification ministry in other locations. In 1895, territorial authorities in Arizona investigated reports of a religious community near Tucson that practiced unusual purification rituals involving blood sacrifice. The leader of this group was described as a tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes who claimed to have received revelations about the true nature of salvation. Similar reports surfaced from Colorado in 1902, New Mexico in 1907, and northern Mexico in 1912. In each case, the communities in question disappeared before authorities could conduct thorough investigations, leaving behind only empty buildings and local rumors about strange religious practices that had attracted devoted followers willing to sacrifice their blood for spiritual purification. The last confirmed sighting of someone matching Bell's description occurred in 1918, when Mexican authorities investigated a religious compound near the border town of Juarez. Witnesses described a charismatic American preacher who had convinced local peasants to participate in blood purification rituals that he claimed would protect them from the influenza pandemic sweeping across North America. By the time Mexican officials reached the compound, they found it abandoned except for the bodies of 17 individuals who appeared to have died from severe blood loss. The American preacher had vanished, along with whatever valuables the community had possessed. Local witnesses provided descriptions that matched Bell's appearance, but he was never apprehended or positively identified. The case files of Reverend Cyrus Bell were finally declassified in their entirety in 1988, exactly 100 years after the great purification ceremony that ended his Philadelphia ministry. The release of these documents provided researchers with unprecedented insights into one of America's earliest documented cases of systematic religious exploitation and mass murder disguised as spiritual practice. Modern analysis of Bell's methods has revealed sophisticated techniques of psychological manipulation that anticipate many of the strategies later used by 20th-century cult leaders. His ability to convince rational adults to participate in their own systematic bleeding demonstrates the power of carefully applied religious imagery combined with graduated exploitation and social isolation. The blood purification rituals that Bell developed represent a particularly insidious form of abuse because they transformed the victim's natural instinct for self-preservation into evidence of spiritual weakness that required correction. Followers who showed reluctance to participate in increasingly extreme blood extraction procedures were told that their fear was evidence of insufficient faith that could only be overcome through additional purification. This psychological framework created a closed loop that made escape virtually impossible for deeply indoctrinated followers. Any doubt or resistance was interpreted as spiritual failure that required more intensive treatment, while compliance with increasingly extreme demands was praised as evidence of spiritual advancement that justified even greater sacrifice. The financial aspects of Bell's operation also demonstrated remarkable sophistication for their time period. His systematic conversion of followers' assets into portable wealth, combined with his apparent establishment of new identities and escape routes, suggest planning that went far beyond the opportunistic fraud typical of religious con artists. The medical aspects of Bell's blood extraction procedures show knowledge of human physiology that he could not have acquired through conventional religious training. His ability to maximize blood extraction while keeping victims alive and conscious suggests either formal medical education or extensive experimentation on unwilling subjects. The ritual chamber that Bell constructed beneath his Philadelphia church represented a significant investment of time and resources that argues against any interpretation of his crimes as spontaneous religious mania. The elaborate system of channels, collection basins, and ceremonial implements required careful planning and considerable expense, indicating that blood purification was always intended as the central element of his ministry. Margaret Whitmore's detailed testimony about the Great Purification Ceremony provides the most complete account of Bell's ultimate intentions for his congregation. Her description of the systematic exsanguination of 31 individuals during a single ritual demonstrates that Bell was willing to sacrifice his entire follower base rather than risk exposure of his activities. The fact that Bell had prepared for this mass execution by liquidating his congregation's assets and arranging for his own disappearance shows that he understood the Great Purification would end his Philadelphia ministry. This suggests that systematic murder of his followers was always part of his long-term strategy rather than a desperate response to external pressure. The legacy of Reverend Cyrus Bell extends far beyond the immediate impact of his crimes. His methods of religious manipulation provided a template that would be followed by numerous later cult leaders who combined spiritual authority with systematic exploitation of followers' trust and resources. The sealed nature of the case files for nearly a century meant that law enforcement agencies and mental health professionals were unable to learn from Bell's techniques, potentially allowing similar exploitation to continue unrecognized in other religious communities. The eventual declassification of these documents has provided valuable insights for modern cult investigators and exit counselors working with survivors of religious abuse. Today, the story of Reverend Cyrus Bell and his blood purification ministry serves as a reminder that the most dangerous religious leaders are often those who appear most devoted to their followers' spiritual welfare. Bell's ability to convince ordinary people to participate in their own systematic bleeding demonstrates the terrifying power of religious authority when combined with sophisticated psychological manipulation. The empty lot in Philadelphia, where Bell's church once stood, remains a testament to the human capacity for both exploitation and survival. While 52 of his followers died in pursuit of the salvation he promised, Margaret Whitmore's courage in escaping and testifying ensured that their deaths would not be forgotten and that future generations might recognize the warning signs of such predatory spirituality. The blood that flowed in that basement chamber on October 13, 1888, carried with it not the salvation that Bell promised, but the knowledge that faith without wisdom can become the deadliest form of blindness. In the end, the only purification achieved was the cleansing of Philadelphia from the presence of a monster who wore the robes of a shepherd while feeding on the flock entrusted to his care.